Elliot Marsh woke before his alarm, the way he always did, in the grey hour when the city outside his window hadn't yet decided whether it was still night or already morning. His apartment was small and tidy, sparse in the way that only comes from someone who has learned not to keep things he doesn't need. He made coffee he wouldn't finish and packed a lunch for his daughter, Sophie, who was 8 years old and still believed, without question, that her father worked in buildings, which was true enough that he'd never had to correct her. He dressed in a jacket that had been mended twice at the elbow, a bag with a strap that had been resewn so many times the stitching had its own history. From the outside, there was nothing about Elliot Marsh that suggested anything other than a tired single father doing his best to get his daughter to school on time and himself to a job that didn't pay enough to matter. That was, of course, exactly the point. What nobody in Sophie's school, nobody on his subway platform, and certainly nobody inside the 40-story glass tower he was about to walk into knew was that Elliot Marsh was not simply an employee of Halloway and Vance Group. He was, through a trust structure his father had built decades earlier, and Elliot had inherited quietly at 26, the controlling owner of the entire firm. He had never worked inside its walls. He had never needed to. The company ran itself, or seemed to, generating returns and headlines, and the kind of reputation that made people speak its name with a certain reverence at dinner parties. But reputations, Elliot had learned, were often built on things nobody bothered to look at closely. And lately, the things reaching him, anonymous emails routed through channels even the board couldn't trace, a whistleblower complaint filed and then mysteriously withdrawn, two resignation letters that used almost identical language about not being valued for their work, had convinced him that something inside Halloway and Vance had gone quietly, systemically wrong, the kind of wrong that doesn't show up in quarterly earnings, the kind that shows up in people. He could have hired investigators. He could have demanded internal audits, sent lawyers, called for a formal review from behind the safety of his ownership stake. Instead, he did something almost nobody in his position would have done. He applied for an internship under a name that was legally his, but that nobody would think to connect to the trust, Elliot Marsh, not the more formal E. Bennett Marsh, that appeared on legal filings, and he walked in through the front doors like anyone else, carrying his resewn bag, wearing his mended jacket, ready to see the company the way its lowest-ranked employees saw it every single day. The tower rose out of downtown like something built to be looked up at, not walked into. Elliot stood on the sidewalk for a moment before entering, the way a man might pause before stepping into cold water, and then went through the revolving doors into a lobby of marble and glass that seemed designed to remind everyone who entered exactly how small they were. At the security desk, a young man barely glanced at him. Name? Elliot Marsh, starting in the intern program today. The man tapped at his screen, frowned, tapped again. You're not showing up as approved yet, might be a system delay. Take a seat, someone will come get you. Elliot took a seat, 15 minutes passed, then 20, while polished shoes and tailored coats moved past him toward the elevators without a second look. Nobody offered to check on the delay. Nobody seemed to think a young man in a mended jacket waiting near security was worth the interruption. Eventually, a harried coordinator appeared, apologized without really apologizing, and walked him up to the 14th floor where the internship program was housed. The floor buzzed with the particular energy of people trying very hard to look busier and more important than they actually were. Elliot noticed it immediately, the way conversations dropped when certain names were mentioned, the way people glanced toward a closed corner office on the far end of the floor, the way sailors might glance at a storm on the horizon. That's her office, a young woman near him murmured, catching him looking. She had a badge that read Priya, analyst, and the kind of tired eyes that suggested she'd learned to keep her head down a long time ago. Vivian Cole, CEO. You'll want to stay out of her direct line of sight if you can help it. That bad? Priya gave him a look that suggested he'd asked something both naive and slightly dangerous. She built this place into what it is. Everyone respects her, just respect from a distance is usually safer. She said it lightly, like a joke, but her eyes didn't agree with her tone. Elliot filed that away and said nothing. His first assignment came from Renata Shaw, Vivian's direct deputy, a woman whose smile arrived a half-second too late to feel genuine and left a half-second too early to feel warm. She looked him over, the jacket first, he noticed, then the bag, then finally his face, before handing him a stack of filing that could have been finished by an intern in half the time she gave him for it. "We'll see what you can handle," she said, in a tone that had already decided the answer, then, almost as an afterthought, glancing at his sleeve where the mending was visible. "Interesting jacket. Vintage or just well-loved?" A few nearby analysts smiled without quite laughing, the way people do when they want credit for the joke without the risk of actually telling it. "Well loved," Elliot said simply, and went to his desk. He spent the day the way he suspected most new hires, without connections or pedigree, probably spent theirs, filing, fetching, waiting to be noticed for reasons that had nothing to do with the quality of his work. He watched. That was the entire point of being there, after all, and what he watched troubled him more with every passing hour. Not one dramatic incident, but 100 small ones, the way certain names got invited to certain meetings and certain names never did, the way confidence was rewarded even when the substance behind it was thin, the way people who looked a particular way, spoke a particular way, seemed to move through the floor with an ease that others, equally capable, never got to experience. By 6 that evening, most of the floor had emptied out, the overhead lights dimming to their evening setting, and Elliot sat alone at a borrowed desk finishing paperwork nobody would check until morning. He allowed himself, finale, to take out his phone and call home. "Hey, Bug," he said, when Sophie picked up, her voice bright and immediate the way it always was. "Dad, Grandma let me stay up to talk to you. How was your first day at the building?" He smiled, alone in the empty office, the mask he'd worn all day slipping just slightly. "Long, but okay, how was school?" She told him about a science project, a friend who'd moved seats, a substitute teacher who let them watch part of a documentary about the ocean. He listened to every word like it was the only thing that had happened all day worth paying attention to, because in the ways that mattered most, it was. "I love you, Bug. I'll see you tomorrow." "Love you too, Dad. Don't work too hard." He hung up, sat in the quiet office a moment longer than he needed to, and looked out at the city light stretching beyond the glass, a view that belonged to him, technically, in a way none of the people who'd looked past him that day would ever guess. Then he packed his bag, the strap fraying slightly at the seam, and rode the elevator down alone, already knowing tomorrow would be worse before it got better. Elliot arrived the next morning to find that word of his mended jacket had apparently travelled faster than he had. 2 analysts near the coffee station stopped talking when he passed, then resumed in lowered voices he wasn't meant to hear but heard anyway. He didn't react. Reacting, he'd learned in his first 24 hours, was exactly what people were watching for. Renata Shaw found him within the hour, holding a folder of numbers that Elliot recognized immediately as the summary of a client analysis he'd stayed late finishing the evening before. Careful, thorough work he'd double-checked twice before leaving. She set the folder down in front of a senior director without so much as glancing in Elliot's direction. "This is the kind of sharp thinking I like to see from my team," Renata said, and the director nodded approvingly, already forgetting the intern sitting 3 desks away, who had actually built every figure in it. Elliot said nothing. He watched Renata accept a compliment for work she hadn't done, watched the director make a small note in his planner that would likely translate into her next performance review, and understood, with the plain clarity of a man who had spent his whole adult life avoiding exactly this kind of environment, that this was not an isolated moment. This was how the floor worked. Credit flowed upward and sideways toward the people already positioned to receive it, and rarely trickled down toward the people who'd actually done the work. He thought, briefly, of walking over and correcting the record. He didn't. Not yet. He was here to see the whole shape of the thing, not to put out one small fire and leave the rest of the building to burn quietly around him. At lunch, he sat alone in the break room, eating a sandwich he'd made that morning, when he became aware of a small cluster of junior staff near the refrigerator, doing impressions of someone. It took him a moment to realize the someone was him, his measured way of speaking exaggerated into a slow drawl, his mended jacket referenced with a hand gesture miming a hole in fabric, his quiet, watchful demeanor mocked as something between simple-mindedness and suspicious secrecy. The group laughed, unaware or unconcerned that he could hear every word from where he sat. He didn't confront them. He finished his sandwich, folded the wrapper neatly and went back to his desk, filing the moment away with the others the way a man builds a case not out of anger but out of necessity. It was later that same afternoon that he first noticed Marcus. No, not Marcus, he corrected himself internally. That was a different life he sometimes still thought in. He noticed a young analyst named David Chen being quietly passed over for a promotion that had, by every metric Elliot could see in the shared performance files, clearly been his to earn. David had the numbers, David had the client relationships, the technical skill, 2 years of consistently strong reviews. What David did not have, Elliot began to understand from overheard hallway conversation, was the right kind of last name, the right university listed on his resume, the right easy rapport with the partners who made these decisions over expensive lunches. David was never invited to. He's solid, Elliot overheard one director say to another near the elevator bank, not bothering to lower his voice. But he's not really, partner material, not yet anyway. The other director didn't ask what not yet was supposed to mean and didn't need to. Both of them understood exactly what had just been said without saying it, and Elliot, standing near enough to hear every word, understood it too. There was another name that surfaced that semi-week, mentioned only briefly, almost in passing, Preston Kane, a senior executive 2 floors up, whose name seemed to produce a particular kind of silence whenever it came up. Elliot noticed it the way you notice a single cracked tile among 100 identical ones, not because it stood out loudly, but because everyone else seemed to be carefully stepping around it. A junior assistant mentioned, in a hushed and half-finished sentence to a co-worker, something about Kane and the thing with the last assistant, before catching herself and changing the subject entirely. Elliot didn't push. He simply remembered. That evening, before he left, he noticed David Chen still at his desk, long after most of the floor had cleared out, staring at a laptop screen with the particular stillness of someone trying very hard not to let his face show what he was feeling. Elliot recognized that stillness. He'd worn it himself, more than once, in a different life before the trust, before the tower, before any of this. He walked over, not with any plan, just with the instinct that had guided most of his better decisions over the years. Rough one? David looked up, startled, then shrugged with practiced casualness. Just double-checking some numbers before tomorrow. The Meridian account? Elliot asked, having glimpsed the file open on his screen. David blinked, surprised the intern knew what he was looking at. Yeah, actually there's a discrepancy I can't quite place. Probably nothing. Elliot leaned over, not touching the keyboard, just looking, and within a few minutes spotted a formatting error in a linked spreadsheet that had been quietly throwing off one of the secondary projections, the kind of small, easy-to-miss mistake that wasn't David's fault at all, buried in a template that had clearly been built poorly long before David inherited it. There, Elliot said, pointing. Column doesn't match the source file, not your error. Whoever built this template left a linking issue. David stared at the screen, then at Elliot, something like disbelief and gratitude crossing his face at once. How did you... You're an intern, 2 days in. Elliot only shrugged. Good eyes, bad luck. Fix that and you're clean. It cost him nothing, no money, no favour called in, no risk to the quiet cover he was making. Just mingo que a willingness to look closer at someone else's problem, instead of walking past it the way everyone else on that floor seemed content to do. David thanked him 3 times before Elliot finally waved it off and headed for the elevator, the same way Walter Hale, in a different story entirely, might have waved off a widow's gratitude for an alternator he'd quietly undercharged her for. The confrontation, when it finally came, arrived on a Thursday, 4 days into Elliot's time on the 14th floor. Vivian Cole rarely walked the general floor. Her presence was usually felt rather than seen, a closed door, a name mentioned in hushed tones, decisions handed down through Renata, like weather passed along by a forecaster, rather than something anyone actually witnessed firsthand. But that Thursday, she emerged from her office mid-afternoon, moving through the floor with the brisk, contained energy of someone reviewing her territory, and stopped for reasons Elliot would only fully understand later, directly at his desk. She looked him over the same way Renata had on his first day. Jacket first, bag second, face last. Except where Renata's assessment had been almost lazy, Vivian's was sharp, immediate, and entirely without warmth. You're the new intern, she said. It wasn't a question. Elliot Marsh, he said, standing, offering a hand she didn't take. I've heard some things, Vivian said, her eyes not quite meeting his. scanning instead the frayed edge of his sleeve, the resewn strap of his bag slung over the back of his chair. About your presentation, your demeanor. I'm not sure I understand, Elliot said, though he understood completely. This firm has a certain standard, Vivian said, her voice carrying just enough for the nearby desks to hear, without her having to raise it at all. A certain image we project, internally and externally. I don't think that standard is being met here. Priya, 2 desks away, had gone very still, eyes fixed on her screen, clearly listening despite pretending otherwise. Renata had appeared at the edge of the scene, arms crossed, an expression that was trying and failing to look neutral. I've done the work assigned to me, Elliot said, evenly. Every task, on time, without error. This isn't about the work, Vivian said, and there was something almost impatient in her tone now, as though she found the clarification tedious. It's about whether you fit, whether you present the way this company needs its people to present. And frankly, Mr. Marsh, I don't think you do. The floor had gone quiet around them, the particular quiet of an office pretending very hard to be absorbed in spreadsheets while missing nothing at all. Elliot said nothing in his own defense. He simply looked at her, steady, unbothered in the way that only unsettled people who expected to see him crumble, and let the silence stretch just a moment too long for comfort. I think it's best, Vivian said finally, if you don't come back tomorrow. The words landed the way words like that always do, quietly devastating, delivered with the kind of casual certainty that made resistance feel pointless. Elliot didn't argue. He didn't reach for his phone, didn't threaten to call anyone, didn't do any of the things a person in his actual position could have done in an instant to make the room understand exactly how enormous a mistake was being made in front of them. He simply nodded once, reached for his bag with its resewn strap and said, "Understood." It was the kind of restraint that looked, to everyone watching, like defeat. It was not defeat. It was patience. The same patience he'd learned from a father who'd built something out of nothing, and taught him that the loudest response was rarely the most powerful one. Renata stepped forward as Elliot gathered the last of his things, and there was something almost gleeful in the set of her mouth, the posture of a woman relieved to see a judgment she'd made on his first day, finally validated by someone with the authority to act on it. I'll walk you out, she offered, in a tone that made clear the offer wasn't kindness but supervision. They hadn't made it past the elevator bank when the first sound reached them, the low, distant rumble of engines, more of them than the building's underground garage typically saw at once, followed by the murmur of a floor slowly turning its attention toward the windows. Priya was the first to say it out loud, half to herself, pressed near the glass. How many cars is that? Below, in the wide drop-off circle in front of the tower, 10 black SUVs had arrived in a slow, deliberate line, doors opening in near-perfect synchronization, security personnel stepping out first, scanning the entrance with the practiced calm of people who did this often, and took it very seriously. Renata's grip on Elliot's elbow, light, guiding, dismissive, slackened without her seeming to notice. The elevator doors opened on the ground floor lobby, just as the first of the arriving group crossed the threshold, and the entire lobby, employees and visitors alike, seemed to still at once, the way a room does when it senses, before it understands, that something significant is happening. Desmond Cruz entered first, tall, composed, unmistakably the head of a security detail, by the way the space around him seemed to reorganize itself, followed closely by an older man Elliot recognized immediately, and the rest of the building did not. Warren Pike, chairman of the board, a man whose face appeared perhaps twice a year in an annual report, and almost nowhere else, a figure so rarely seen in person that half the junior staff in the lobby wouldn't have recognized him, even if his name had been printed on his forehead. Warren Pike scanned the lobby once, methodically, the way a man looks for something he already expects to find, and then his eyes landed on Elliot, mended jacket, resewn bag, standing beside a stunned Renata Shaw near the elevator bank, and something in the older man's face shifted from searching to certain. "Mr. Marsh," Warren said, his voice carrying easily across the marble lobby, warm and immediate in a way that silenced every conversation within 30 feet. "We came as soon as we heard there might be a scheduling issue with your visit today. I hope the staff have been treating you well." The lobby did not merely go quiet, It seemed to hold its breath entirely. Desmond Cruz stepped forward and, without hesitation, without theatre, simply inclined his head toward Elliot in the unmistakable gesture of a man deferring to someone whose authority he had never once questioned. "Sir, security detail is ready whenever you'd like to move." Renata's hand, still resting near Elliot's elbow from her earlier grip, dropped entirely. Her face, the same face that had looked him over with lazy dismissal on his first day, the same face that had accepted credit for David Chen's work without a flicker of guilt, had gone the particular shade of pale that comes from watching an entire understanding of the world rearrange itself in real time. "Mr. Marsh," she repeated, the name suddenly sounding foreign in her own mouth, as though she were trying it on for the first time and finding it didn't fit anything she'd believed 20 seconds earlier. Elliot turned to her, and there was no cruelty in his expression, no triumph, nothing that resembled the satisfaction someone in his position might have been forgiven for allowing themselves. Just a level, steady calm. "Renata, I think there's been some confusion about who exactly you were speaking to a few minutes ago. Word moved through the lobby and up through the building the way word always does in moments like this. Not through any announcement, but through the sheer, visible evidence of what everyone was witnessing." Employees who had been heading out for the evening stopped near the doors. Analysts leaned over the mezzanine railing above, phones half raised, uncertain whether filming this was appropriate or career-ending, and deciding in the end that some moments simply had to be witnessed rather than recorded. Vivian Cole, alerted by a call from her assistant that something was happening in the lobby that she needed to see immediately, arrived at the top of the escalator just in time to watch Warren Pike shake Elliot Marsh's hand with the easy familiarity of men who had known each other in some capacity for years. She stopped walking. For a woman whose entire professional identity had been built on always being the most informed person in any room, the confusion on her face was almost painful to witness. "Warren," she said carefully, descending the last few steps, her voice pitched to sound composed and landing somewhere closer to unsteady. "What's going on here?" Warren Pike turned to her with the politer, distant courtesy of a man addressing someone he respected professionally but was about to disappoint significantly. "Vivian, I understand there was a personnel decision made about an hour ago. I think you'll want to hear the full context before it goes any further." Context? Vivian looked from Warren to Elliot, and something in her expression suggested the pieces were assembling themselves faster than she wanted them to, faster than she was ready for. "He's an intern. I made a judgment call about culture fit. He's the controlling owner of this company, Vivian," Warren said, quietly enough that it wasn't a performance, but clearly enough that everyone within earshot heard every syllable. "Has been since he was 26. The trust his father established gives him full authority over every decision this board makes, including, as of about 10 minutes ago, the decision to personally review the way this firm treats the people at the bottom of it." The colour that had already drained from Renata's face seemed to find its way in that moment into Vivian's as well. Elliot let the silence sit for a moment before speaking, not because he wanted to savour it, but because he understood that some silences do more work than any words could. "I didn't come here to catch anyone," he said finally, his voice carrying the same even calm it had held all week, filing papers, absorbing insults, watching quietly from a desk nobody thought mattered. "I came because I got reports that something in this company had gone wrong, and I didn't trust that hiring an outside firm to investigate would show me the truth the way walking the floor myself would. I was right to worry. In 4 days, I watched credit for good work handed to people who didn't do it." He glanced, briefly, toward Renata, who didn't meet his eyes. "I watched a talented analyst passed over for a promotion he'd clearly earned, for reasons that had nothing to do with his performance. I heard things about at least one senior executive that deserve a much closer look than they've apparently gotten so far." A murmur moved through the gathered employees at that, quiet but unmistakable, several eyes drifting upward toward the higher floors where Preston Kane's office sat. "And I was fired an hour ago for the crime of wearing a jacket that's been mended more than once." Nobody in the lobby said a word. Vivian Cole, for what might have been the first time in her professional life, found herself with absolutely nothing to say. "There's going to be a full, independent review," Elliot continued, "of hiring, promotion, dismissal and conduct across this company, starting immediately and reporting directly to me and the board. Nobody's job is safe simply because of a title, and nobody's job is at risk simply because of where they went to school or how expensive their jacket happens to be. He paused, glancing once more at Vivian, and when he spoke again, his tone had softened slightly. Not out of pity, but out of something closer to genuine hope that she might actually hear it. This isn't about revenge, Vivian. It's about finding out what this company actually is, underneath what it's been pretending to be. I'd rather rebuild something honest than punish something broken. But that only works if the people responsible are willing to be honest about what they did. Vivian said nothing. She simply stood very still at the base of the escalator, the whole floor watching her, the weight of 4 days' worth of small cruelties, hers and Renata's and dozens of others, settling over the lobby like a held breath finally released. The review began the next morning. The independent review took 6 weeks to complete, and in that time, Halloway and Vance Group changed in ways that no press release could have adequately captured, though plenty of reporters would eventually try. The findings, when they were finally compiled into a report thick enough to require its own binding, told a story that surprised almost no one who had actually worked on the lower floors and shocked nearly everyone who had worked on the upper ones. Promotions across 3 departments had, for years, correlated far more closely with university pedigree and personal rapport with senior partners than with any measurable performance metric. Dismissals disproportionately affected employees from backgrounds the firm's unspoken culture had quietly decided didn't fit, regardless of how their actual work compared to those who stayed, and tucked into an appendix that took investigators the longest to substantiate, precisely because so many people around Preston Kane had learned to stay quiet about it, was a pattern of conduct toward junior assistants that had been reported twice before, informally, and buried both times by people more concerned with Kane's revenue numbers than with the assistants who'd tried to speak up. Preston Kane was terminated within a week of the findings being confirmed, escorted from the building, on a Tuesday morning with considerably less ceremony than he'd once commanded walking through it. Elliot made sure the 2 assistants whose reports had been buried were informed directly, in person, that they'd been believed, and that the burying itself was now part of a separate inquiry into who had covered for him and why. David Chen received his promotion 3 weeks into the review, backdated, with an apology from the partner who'd once called him not partner material, not yet anyway. An apology David later told Elliot felt almost stranger than the promotion itself, since he'd never expected anyone above him to admit fault about anything, let alone something so specific. Renata Shaw did not survive the review in her role, though she survived it in the sense that mattered more to Elliot. She wasn't purged from the company entirely, only removed from any position where she managed people directly, a decision Elliot made deliberately, over the objections of at least 2 board members who wanted a cleaner, more satisfying story. Firing everyone who made a bad call doesn't fix a culture that rewarded bad calls in the first place, he told them, in a boardroom meeting that Warren Pike would later describe, admiringly as the first time he'd watched a 29-year-old quiet a room full of people twice his age without raising his voice once. Vivian Cole's suspension was announced publicly the same week Preston Kane's termination made the business press, and for a period of nearly a month, Halloway and Vance's name appeared in headlines that had nothing to do with earnings and everything to do with culture, misconduct, and a young intern who had turned out to be the company's own owner. Contracts wobbled. 2 smaller clients quietly moved their business elsewhere, unwilling to wait and see how the story ended. Employees who had said nothing during the years the culture had been forming now found themselves fielding uncomfortable questions from friends and family about what exactly they'd known and when. It would have been easy in that period for Elliot to simply let Vivian go the way the board initially expected, a graceful resignation, a severance package, a clean break that would let the headlines move on to something else. Vivian herself seemed to expect it. When Elliot finally met with her privately, 6 weeks after the lobby confrontation, she arrived at the meeting already composed for that ending, a folder of resignation paperwork in her bag that she never got the chance to hand over. "I built this place," she said, quietly, sitting across from him in a conference room that had until recently been hers. "I know that doesn't excuse what the review found. I know it doesn't excuse what I did to you personally, or to people like David, or the people Kane hurt, while everyone around him decided it wasn't worth the trouble of stopping him. I just..." She stopped, and for the first time since Elliot had met her, Something in her face looked less like control and more like exhaustion. I don't actually know how to fix something I didn't know was broken. I thought I was building a company with high standards. I didn't realize how much of what I called a standard was really just comfort. People who looked like me, sounded like me, made the same assumptions I did about what competence was supposed to look like. Elliot listened without interrupting, the same patient attention he'd given David Chen's spreadsheet, the same quiet regard he'd once given a hallway conversation about Preston Kane that everyone else had been careful to talk around. I'm not going to pretend the last 6 weeks haven't cost this company, he said finally. They have, but I'd rather have a company that survives an honest reckoning than one that quietly protects the same mistakes for another 20 years. He paused. I'm not offering you your title back. I don't think that would be right, for you or for anyone who watched what happened in that lobby, but I am offering you a choice. You can leave with the severance the board's already approved, and nobody here will begrudge you that. Or you can stay in a role with no direct authority over anyone and actually learn what this company looks like from a desk like the one I sat at for 4 days. No title, no corner office, just the work and the chance to understand what you missed. Vivian was quiet for a long moment. Outside the conference room glass, the 14th floor moved through its afternoon the way it always had. Phones ringing, keyboards clattering, a version of ordinary that felt strange to both of them, given everything that had happened since the last time either had stood in this room. Why would you offer me that? She asked finally. After everything I did. Because firing you would be easy, Elliot said. And easy isn't always the same as right. My father used to say that people show you who they really are twice, once when things are going well, and once when everything falls apart. You've shown me who you were during the first version. I'd like to see the second before I decide there's nothing left worth investing in. She took the offer. It surprised almost everyone who heard about it, including, by her own later admission, Vivian herself. The months that followed were not dramatic in the way the lobby confrontation had been, and that, Elliot had come to believe, was precisely the point. Real change rarely looked like a single cinematic moment. It looked like David Chen mentoring two new analysts who reminded him of himself 3 years earlier, patient in a way none of his own early mentors had bothered to be. It looked like the assistants who'd reported Preston Kane returning to work without flinching every time they passed his old office, now occupied by someone new. Someone the review board had vetted more carefully than anyone had ever vetted Kane himself. It looked like a hiring policy quietly rewritten to strip identifying details from resumes during the first round of review, a small procedural change that within 4 months had shifted the department's new hires to include people from universities nobody on the original hiring committee would have previously glanced twice at. It looked, most of all, like Vivian Cole, 6 months after the lobby confrontation, sitting in a junior analyst role on the 11th floor, personally seeking out an employee she'd once dismissed during her tenure as CEO, a woman named Farah Doyle, whose promotion Vivian herself had blocked years earlier over what the record, once reviewed, revealed to be nothing more than a vague, undocumented feeling that Farah wasn't quite leadership material. Vivian found her at her desk on a Thursday afternoon and asked, without an audience, without cameras, without anything to gain from the moment except the discomfort of doing it, whether she could speak with her privately. I was wrong about you, Vivian said, once they were alone. Not just procedurally wrong, personally wrong. I let an assumption I never bothered to examine cost you 2 years of advancement you'd earned. I don't have a way to give you those 2 years back, but I wanted you to hear directly from me that it wasn't your work. It was never your work, it was me. Farah, who had spent 2 years believing quietly that she simply wasn't good enough, sat with that for a long moment before answering. Thank you for saying that, she said finally. I don't know if it fixes anything, but it means something that you said it. It wasn't a scene that made headlines, it wasn't meant to, but word of it moved through the 11th floor the way word does in any office, and by the end of that week, something had shifted in how people spoke about Vivian Cole, not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but the beginning of something that might one day resemble it. A year after Elliot Marsh had first walked through the revolving doors of Halloway and Vance Group in a mended jacket, the company looked, on paper, remarkably similar to the one he'd walked into. The tower still rose 40 stories above downtown. The name on the building hadn't changed. The revenue, After a rocky few months during the height of the scandal, had recovered and then some, buoyed by a wave of new business from clients who cited the company's transparency during the crisis as a reason for choosing them over competitors who'd never been tested the same way. But underneath the unchanged surface, nearly everything was different. David Chen now sat on the promotions committee himself, personally ensuring the same blind, merit-based process that had finally recognized his own work extended to everyone who came after him. Farah Doyle led a team of her own, one that included 2 analysts hired specifically because their resumes, stripped of identifying details, had impressed the committee on merit alone. Renata Shaw, in a role with no authority over anyone but herself, had become, against most expectations, including her own, one of the most careful and thorough individual contributors on the 14th floor, no longer performing confidence for an audience, simply doing the work. And Elliot Marsh, once a month or so, still walked the floors of the company he owned, dressed the same unremarkable way he always had, jacket a little more worn now, bag carrying the same resewn strap. Most of the newer employees had no idea who he was. He preferred it that way. He wasn't there to be recognized. He was there the way he'd always been, to see the company the way the people inside it actually experienced it, not the version presented in quarterly reports, not the version performed for board meetings, but the real one built one small decision at a time by people who mostly never expected anyone important to be watching. Sophie, now 9, still believed her father worked in buildings, which remained, in its own quiet way, entirely true. Some evenings, riding the elevator down alone after everyone else had gone home, Elliot thought about the 4 days he'd spent as an intern nobody wanted to look twice at, and about how close the whole truth had come to staying buried, simply because nobody with power had bothered to walk the floor and see what was actually happening beneath it. He thought about Vivian, learning humility the slow way, one uncomfortable conversation at a time. He thought about David and Farah and the 2 assistants who'd finally been believed. And he thought most of all about how little any of it had required from him beyond the willingness to show up quietly, watch closely, and refuse to look away from what he found. The tower's lights stayed on latte into the evening, the way they always had, the way city towers do, full of people who had no idea most nights that anything about their company had ever needed saving at all.